This took place right next to the asylum I was living in. The place was shut down for several reasons. Officially, they said the building had fallen into disrepair, but among the residents there were claims of ghosts, unusual deaths, and injuries from people who had been in there. At times, even before we were sneaking over there, we had seen movement in the windows, leering faces, and other strange happenings that we couldn't explain. This is one experience that happened to me at this place. It was me, Billy, and Tammy going into this place. We went around the backside. Some of the floors had windows and some did not. In the back there was a window that had no glass in it. However, the window was high enough that we had to lift the others to the ledge. I was typically the last one up because I could jump high enough to grab the hands of the others. Then they would pull me up. First thing is, the entire area is gloomy. There is glass on the floor and debris all over the place. Other than that, it simply looks like a building that was old and falling further into disrepair. The wind could be heard blowing through holes in the walls, making strange noises. There is enough light in the building that we can see clearly. The first floor has no windows except in the front, which are slitted, giving it a prison-like feel to it. The 3 floors above had windows that let in the light, so you could see bed frames, blankets, sheets, and curtains. The floor is stained brown, and there are scorch marks here and there in the building. Some of the windows are intact, but most were not, which let the wind blow through the building, making the temperature fluctuate constantly as we walked through. We found some of the windows that faced our dorm on the top floor, where we had seen some movement. There were no curtains in the windows, which could explain what we could have seen. On the floor there were several stains and scorch marks, and a place where it looked like someone had built a fire and had used some of the debris around the building to burn. Obviously there had been some people in here at some point in time. After we checked out the top 2 floors and found nothing of note, we went back down the stairs to a landing on the first floor, and we see a room just light enough by the ambient light from the front of the building. This is the first time we were really able to notice the smell. On the upper floors you would get a whiff of garbage every now and again, but the wind kept most of this to a minimum. That was not the case here. The first thing we noticed was there was not as much air current in this room, and the room smelled of rot and decay. We headed down toward the light of the main door. It is locked and barred, so of course we cannot get through. There are rooms on either side of the hall, where the main door is located, so we started looking into these doors. Most of these are rooms that have been made into a modified school. The first one we go into is a bathroom. The room looks like it has not seen use in quite a while. Some of the toilets are broken and there is paper and rock all over the floor. As we continue down the hallway, we start to hear things that we had not been hearing before. We can hear mice scurrying around and objects being displaced. At 12 years old, this only added to the disturbing feelings that this place elicited. There were also a lot more burn marks down here than there had been on the upper floors. It looked as if a fire had broken out in this part of the building at some point. We continued looking into rooms for about 10 minutes, and that is when we hear a door slam. We cannot determine if it came from in front or behind us. We freeze and try to listen for any clue as to where the noise came from. We listen for a few minutes and we begin to hear footsteps. They are not moving quickly, but rather at a steady walk. As far as we know, we were alone in the building. At this point, we wanted to know where the footsteps were coming from, but at that same time, we wanted to leave. Bolstered by each other's company, we decided to stay. Taking cues from the sounds we heard, we followed the footsteps. The sounds seemed to be going away from us. We picked up the pace as we give pursuit, thinking one of the others was trying to scare us. We come across another staircase that was barricaded up with display cases and bed frames. We go down a hallway that opens into a big dorm that looks like it once could have been a library. The shelves are empty though. There's only one exit to the library, so there's no way someone could have gotten in another way. We go back and past the block stairwell and go the opposite direction. We go through what appeared to be a cafeteria for the building. We go back another hallway with classrooms and desks in there. There are no stairs around for someone to get away. We go back to the stairs where we came down from the second floor and realize there is not any place someone could have gone except downstairs to the basement. This is particularly scary because this is where most of the stories come from about scary things happening to people. We notice a door that is off its hinges and the smell is extremely strong in this part of the building. We are talking to each other and we hear a thump in front of us. In the shadows we see movement, but we can't really catch what it was because our flashlights are pointed a different direction at the time. We give chase thinking that we have caught the people trying to scare us. Ahead we hear bumps and thuds like someone is trying to get away. Our lights are pointing forward, but we do not see anything. We do not see anything moving ahead of us, but we hear the sound of running footsteps. Ahead of us we see a door slam and hear footsteps. The problem is, we do not see what closed the door. At this point, fear gets the better of us and we start to run away as fast as we can go. It might have been my imagination, but it seemed as if the footsteps were chasing us now. We ran back to the stairwell and up to the second floor. We continued to run to the room where we got into the building, just in time to see another group trying to get in. After hearing our story, they decided it was better to leave with us. We ran all the way back to the dorm in complete panic. Every family has some relative, somewhere in their family tree that has some strange story associated with them. My family, well, there have been several people who have claimed to be sensitive or just came right out and said that they could communicate with spirits. It has always been a touchy subject within our family because they were always labeled crazy cousin, or uncle so-and-so is a bit touched if you know what I mean. But for the most part, these people were shunned by the majority and were essentially treated as if they did not exist. That is why this incident was so disturbing and heartbreaking at the same time. My son Ian was only 3 years old when this happened. He seemed to be hanging on to the terrible twos a little longer than we had hoped. He would scream, cry, and yell almost constantly. Not because he wanted or needed anything, but simply for attention. We tried everything we could to try and calm him down. I don't know how many books we read just to try and find a way for us to help him. Then one day he was screaming at the top of his lungs for what seemed like a solid hour. He was getting hoarse. It had been going on for so long. If someone could have heard him, I'm sure they thought we were mistreating him in some way. Then he seemed to turn toward the hallway and suddenly stopped. He smiled and began to crawl to an open part of the room and sat there staring off into space. Every minute or so he would laugh, giggle, or say a few words to seemingly no one. It was odd and kind of creepy at the time, but it was a relief from his usual behavior. I started to get worried when this continued for over an hour. I tried to pull him away, but as soon as I tried, he would go back to the screaming until I let him go, and he could crawl back to the place that he had been before. Finally, I just came out and asked him who he was talking to. "Ian, who are you talking to?" "Nobody." That is all I could get from him that first day. I thought that maybe he had developed some sort of imaginary friend or something. Lots of kids do that kind of thing, so I did not worry about it too much at first. When it continued though past the first week, I decided it would be best to talk to him about this friend of his. I wanted Ian to have friends in the real world and had been reaching out to some of the moms that I knew in order to give him some kids his own age to play with, hoping that would stop the fantasy. No matter what I did though, he would just sit there and stare down into the hall, talking to nobody. He would completely ignore the other kids, almost like he had no interest in them at all. With no other options, I decided to take him to a child psychologist to see if they can figure out what was going on with him. At first, Ian seemed reluctant to talk about his conversations that he was having, continuing to say that he was talking to no one. But finally, after a couple of sessions, he finally admitted to who his invisible friend was. "I'm talking to Grandpa." This was an answer that I really did not expect. My father had died even before he was born, and so he had never met him before. To this point, I had never even heard him use that word before, which was the strangest part of the answer he gave. To have a concept of who that was seemed beyond what my 3-year-old should have been capable of. When the psychologist asks Ian to describe what he looked like, though, what he said scared me. Somehow, he was able to give an accurate and detailed description of what my dad had looked like shortly before he died. Frankly, it seemed unbelievable. After this session, I really was at a loss for what to do. I mean, was it possible that my dad was visiting Ian? I did not know what to think. Encouraging it seemed risky at best, because I didn't want to feed the fantasy which I believed it to be. On the other hand, though, he wasn't hurting anyone, and he hadn't been throwing the fits that he had for over a year now. Any improvement, no matter the cause, was a welcome change. A week later, I had my answer to whether it was real or not. I was asleep in my bed when the sound of my door shutting woke me up. I thought maybe Ian had come into my room and was looking to sleep with me that night, something that he did on occasion. Turning and opening my eyes just a crack, I noticed a soft blue glow coming from the end of my bed. Unsure of the cause, I rolled over the rest of the way, and for a split second, I saw my father standing there looking down on me, smiling. The feeling I got when I saw him can only be described as an overwhelming sense of love. It was like being warmed from the inside. It was so powerful that I started to cry. For some reason, my dad had come to comfort my son during a time in his life where he must have needed him a great deal. After I saw my dad in my room that night, Ian no longer sat by himself and talked to my dad. Whatever purpose he meant to serve was done now. Ian also seemed to be cured of the terrible twos as well. I'm so happy that my son had the ability to meet his grandfather. As time goes on, I'm sure that the memory of what happened will fade. But I will always know that my dad loves his grandson. Me and my wife are getting advanced in our years, so when it comes to sleeping through the night, it does not really happen. I'm having to get up time and again to go to the bathroom. One of those crappy parts to look forward to when everyone gets older, I guess. Next to our bed, we have a mirror that I catch my reflection out of the corner of my eye. Even though I know it is a mirror, and I see it during the day, my shadowed reflection never fails to creep me out. I've considered asking my wife to move it, but I know it will sound like the ramblings of an old man beginning to lose his mind, so I haven't mentioned anything. One evening I was really feeling worn out, so I told my wife I was going to go take a little nap before dinner. She told me she would get me up when it was getting close and went off somewhere else in the house. She told me that at some point she had to use the bathroom whose door faces our bed. She said that in the mirror in the bathroom she saw me sit up and start to crawl down to the end of our bed. Given that I am in my late 70s, I don't have the strength or range of motion that I used to. So when she saw me lift myself up off the bed with my legs and arms like some sort of bug, she found it really strange. She then saw me stand up, walk over and lean against the doorframe to the bathroom and just stand there. She has told me that the look in my eyes was really unsettling. It was like I was a different person, she would later describe. She turned to talk to me, but when she looked where she had seen me in the mirror, I was still sound asleep in bed. Unease and bewilderment gave way to fear as she grappled with what she had just seen. She said at this point she started to panic, not sure if she was having some sort of health crisis or something else was going on. She backed up against the sink and just stared at me in bed. She was torn between wanting to let me sleep and waking me to set her mind at ease. As much as she did not want to be alone right then, she wanted to let me get some rest. When she turned around to look back in the mirror, the entire thing had been covered in a thin coat of condensation, and there were handprints all over the mirror like someone had touched it over and over again. That is when she screamed. I sat quickly upright in the bed, unsure of what was going on. It took me a few seconds to get my bearings, but when I did, I was at her side as quickly as I could. She pointed out the mirror, too scared to say anything else, just then, and buried her head into my shoulder. I did not really know what she was so worried about, since it just looked like she had touched the mirror while it was wet. When I asked her what was wrong, she had calmed down long enough to tell me what she had seen in the mirror, and then how the handprints seemed to have just appeared out of nowhere. A cold chill ran down my spine, and it wasn't just from the story my wife had told. As fantastic as it sounded, she was not someone who could scare easily or to make up something like this. I myself already didn't like what I saw every night in the mirror next to our bed, and this wasn't about to help matters either. I felt a cold breeze pass along the back of my neck suddenly, and the hair on the back of my neck started standing on end. I started looking around to see if there was anything in the room with us, but all I saw was the empty room. My wife and I both turned toward the door as footsteps seemed to be walking away from the bathroom and into our bedroom. I could feel her begin to shiver in my arms, and I knew she had heard them too. We both sat there for a few minutes, not sure if we wanted to follow into our bedroom. The sounds had been scary enough to keep us frozen in place where we were. Finally, I decided I had stood there long enough, and I walked back into where I had been soundly sleeping just a few minutes before. The room was warm and did not seem off to me. Even if it did though, I'm not sure I could have done anything about it anyways. Not wanting to be left alone, she followed close behind me as we pushed deeper into the bedroom. No strange noises happened. No cold breezes, just stillness and silence. Whatever had been there seemed to have left. Thankfully, there has not been an encore performance to this event in our home. Frankly, I think I would move out of there if there was. Our home is older, so I suppose that it is possible that someone had died there at one point in its history and could still be residing here with us. I have always been interested in the paranormal and spirits, but always from a distance, and that is how I'd prefer it too. Our daughter was born in the fall. For the first little bit, we were living with my mom and dad until our house was finished being built. Our room was upstairs and little Emma's room was to the right side of ours. The first odd thing to happen was when my husband Richard and I were in bed talking about politics. We are both big on that topic and love to debate with each other. I heard Emma sigh while sleeping, and it sounded like the monitor moved a little bit. It was hard to describe the sound. It was like the sound of when someone bumps a camera while it's on a camera stand. We both looked over at the monitor and saw what looked like 2 or maybe 3 shadow people standing at the foot of her bassinet. Richard jumped out of bed and went to check on her while I was still staring at the baby cam. The minute he flipped the lights on, they all disappeared. Like poof, gone. It blew my mind. I yelled at him to shut the lights off again, and he did. Nothing was on the monitor. Odd. Did we see what we thought we saw? With nothing else happening on the monitor, we brushed it off as our mind playing tricks and went to sleep. About a month later, in the middle of the night, we were fast asleep. We were jolted from our slumber to what sounded like fists banging on the other side of our wall, Emma's room. Again, Richard jumped out of bed and ran in there while I hastily grabbed the baby cam and checked it. I saw nothing out of the ordinary. No shadows, nothing. Richard came back in, shrugging. He hadn't seen anything unusual either. Fast forward about 3 months or so, we were about 2 weeks away from our house being finished. It was the day we did the final walkthrough on our home. My mom and dad had flown to Hawaii the day before to celebrate their wedding anniversary, so we had the house to ourselves for a whole week. Like before,
It was bedtime. Richard had already dozed off and was lightly snoring, and my eyes were getting tired as well. I was just reaching for the lamp to shut it off when I heard what sounded like 2 jumps. It was like someone jumped 2 times in the hallway really hard. I pulled my hand back and just laid there and listened. I wasn't sure if I'd really heard anything. I was really tired, so maybe my mind was messing with me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. It was a pounding down the hall, like a sprint headed right for our side of the hallway. I punched Richard in the arm, and he awoke just as the footsteps sounded like they reached our door. It took everything in me not to scream at the top of my lungs. I was so terrified. Something had just run full force from one end of the hallway to either our door or Emma's. "What the hell?" Richard squealed. "Why'd you punch me?" "Did you hear it?" I hissed a whisper. "Hear what?" "Footsteps. Something ran from the other side of the hallway and stopped when it reached our door. Please, go check." I gave him a terrified glance. He sighed and shook his head as he got out of bed and went out into the hallway. Then I heard him open Emma's door and check her room. Nothing. By the time our house was ready to move into, we were both sleep-deprived and eager to get the heck out of my parents' home. After we moved in, I feared maybe something could have followed us there. We've been in our new home for 4 years now with nothing otherworldly happening. I was 13 when it began. I was elated to attend a sleepover for a friend's birthday. I was fairly new to this school, so it was a big deal that I fit in. After all the party activities and movies, we were upstairs in my friend Liliana's room. Some of us were getting sleepy, others were still wide awake and chatty. Liliana pulled out a Ouija board from underneath her bed and started giggling. She asked if we wanted to play. Everyone but me immediately agreed. Most of the girls did not believe in such things, but growing up watching ghost movies, I was more hesitant. With all their curious gazes cast my direction awaiting my answer, I nodded and agreed. I just didn't want to be teased for being the only one who didn't want to play with it. That was probably my biggest mistake. The girls sat in a circle and we put the board on the floor in the middle of us. We all leaned over and put a finger on the planchette. Haley began by asking the questions. First, it was simple things like, "Hello," or "How are you?" or "When did you die?" None of these brought much of an answer. Everyone but I was beginning to get discouraged. I was elated and ready to stop playing this game. Sophie asked the question next. "Would you like to hurt one of us?" We all looked at her in disbelief. Why the heck would you ask a spirit board game something so insane? If there was something there, it would take that as an invitation. The planchette finally did move to our horror and spelled out my name, Nicole. I jerked my finger off the planchette as if I had been burned and refused to partake in anything else. There was the usual arguing of, "You made it move." "You did." "No, you did." "That's not funny." I sat off in the corner of the room trying to gain my wits while they disagreed between themselves. I was ready for this slumber party to be over at this point. I just wanted to go home. Mostly I was embarrassed that I let it faze me so much because it probably wasn't real anyways. However, part of me felt uneasy that it had pinpointed me. Maybe it was just one of the girls trying to mess with me. Haley came over to me and gave me a big sympathetic hug. "I'll put the board away, and we can do something else. We can watch another movie and I will let you pick it." I nodded and watched as she stuffed the board back under her bed. Then I sunk deep in my sleeping bag and tried my best to push the game from my mind so I could sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I awoke to wetness on my face. It was warm and syrupy. I sat upright in my sleeping bag and wiped at my face. It was blood. Looking around the room, I noticed all of the girls were awake but Amy, and they were staring at me in panic. Confused, I ran to the bathroom and took care of my bloody nose. Once I got it under control, I came back in the bedroom, to all eyes again on me. "What?" I demanded. Haley gulped. "You were talking in your sleep." "Like a lot," Sophie chimed in. "What did I say?" I asked as I situated back into my sleeping bag while holding toilet paper to my nose. "Couldn't understand most of it, honestly," Haley stated. "You did say die before you woke up, though," Haley recalled. "You guys are nerds. You're freaking yourselves out. Go to sleep." I was trying to keep my cool, acting tough and unfazed by all of it. But to be honest, I felt a little uneasy, and not quite myself. Also, I never got nosebleeds. I think I may have had one in my entire life. Weird. The next morning I was relieved to finally be home and far away from that board. It gave me the creeps. I took a long shower and laid on my bed reading a book I had started over a week ago. And then there was a loud bang on my bedroom door, like one loud knock. I went over to the door and opened it. No one was there and nothing was on the carpet. I shut the door and walked back over to the bed. Before I could lay down on the bed, I felt it again. Hot, sticky, and warm. My nose was bleeding again. I rushed to the bathroom and took care of it. Why was I having all of these nosebleeds all of a sudden? Stress, maybe? I tried my best to ignore it. I laid back down and held the tissue to my nose with one hand and my book in the other and tried to clear my mind. I thought that as long as I didn't believe in it or acknowledge it was weird, it couldn't happen. But that's not true now, is it? The rest of the day was fine and nothing unusual happened. I was beginning to be my bright and cheery self again by bedtime. I was miles from that board and it couldn't faze me. At bedtime, I turned my TV volume on low, as just some slight background noise to keep my mind from wandering to anything negative. I drifted off fairly easily and slept soundly. At 3 in the morning, I awoke with a startle. I was not in my bed. I squinted my eyes in the darkness and looked around to figure out where I was. I was in the kitchen, standing in front of the island. I looked down at my hand and I was holding a knife. Immediately, I placed it on the counter. That's when I saw the word die spelled out in salt on the countertop. What the heck was happening? I wanted to run upstairs and wake up my parents. I was so terrified. But they would think I was making it up or being ridiculous. I swallowed my fear and wiped the salt off into the trash. I would find answers myself. I ran up the stairs 2 at a time in fear something was following me. I seriously felt like I was being watched. It was creepy. In my room, I pulled out my laptop and searched multiple articles on Ouija boards. That's when my heart sank. We never said goodbye when we were playing with the board. We needed to say goodbye and maybe all of this would stop. The next morning, I called Haley and asked if I could come over so that we could say goodbye on the board. She agreed and we did just that. After we said goodbye, I have not had any more sleepwalking issues or seen the word die written anywhere. I still get chronic nosebleeds, however, and the doctors cannot figure out why.
I had a more fortunate childhood than most. I grew up in a house that was quite large in size, surrounded by wineries and mountains. On the outside, the house was aged but serene. A historic gem tucked neatly in between a vast forest and acres of aromatic grapes. I distinctly remember when I would play in the backyard how the aroma of grapes would surround me like a heavenly embrace. I miss that smell. However, I do not miss that house. The home was built in the late 1800s. The outside had weathered well over the years, but the inside needed constant repair. I remember how my mother would get frustrated every few months over something breaking. Whether it be the stove not working, the pipes needing mending, or floorboards creaking, it seemed like a pit hole of endless restorations.
Due to the house's age, at first, we easily brushed things off as the house settling. There would be knocks, creaks, bangs, you name it. My parents would say, "This is just an old house. It's just settling. No need to fret." Like an obedient child, I believed them, at first. Then the disembodied voices began. First, in the cellar, when I was fetching a bottle of wine for my parents. My mom was making dinner, and my father was changing out of his work clothes. My mom had turned to me, soup ladle in hand, and said, "Johnny, can you fetch Mommy a bottle of the rose label wine?" I'd glanced at her then at the cellar door. I hated the cellar. It just emitted the creepiest of vibes. I mean, truly, what little kid enjoys going down in a dark, half-finished basement anyways? None that I can think of. Knowing that her question was more of a statement than a question, I nodded hesitantly and made my way to the cellar door. The steps cracked under my feet as my eyes searched the pitch black for the light. It was one of those pull-string lights, and of course, it resided at the bottom of the stairs, which was completely unhelpful. As I neared the bottom of the stairs, I heard shuffling, like you would hear if you were dragging something across a concrete floor. I stopped in place and listened, my heart beating faster with every passing second. I heard nothing more. I shrugged to myself and begged myself to believe it must have been my footsteps on the stairs. I continued to the light. Once I lifted my hand to wave into the darkness to find the string to the light, I froze. Disembodied voices were coming from my right. The only thing to my right, however, was a furnace and an entry to a small room no one ever used. I could not make out what any of the whispers were saying, but I knew they were indeed voices. Were they voices of the dead? I trembled, turned on my feet, and started running up the stairs, praying to God I would not fall and break my neck. I burst out of the cellar door breathless, and my mom, still stirring dinner, looked up from the pot, surprised. "Johnny, why are you running around in the cellar? You're causing such a racket," she scolded me, waving her ladle in the air before she went back to stirring. "Did you fetch the bottle?" I was not going back down there, so I lied. "The light bulb is burnt out. I can't find my way around." Just as the words came out of my mouth, my father came sauntering in the room. "I'll have a look at it, honey." He leaned over and pecked her cheek and gave me a stern look as if punishing me with his eyes for my silliness of the dark. He pushed past me and headed for the cellar. I turned my body and followed him with my eyes until he disappeared through the threshold. My mind was frantic with thoughts, mostly worried my dad would not return. After a minute, my father reappeared with the bottle in hand and handed it to my mother. "What was wrong with the light?" my mom asked. My father shot me a distasteful look, then softened himself as he turned to my mother. "Nothing, honey. It just must have been too hard for Johnny to pull." I eyed my feet in embarrassment and retreated to my room until dinner was ready. I did not like being in the house by myself. If I would come home from school on any day and no one was home, I would wait in the front yard until someone else arrived home. Why was this, you ask? Obviously, it was not just because of silly cellar incident. No. Many more incidents happened throughout the years. I cannot even count them all, let alone recollect them all. I was terrified to be home alone because something was in that house. Probably multiple somethings, rather. One like my sister's bedroom. Who knows, maybe at one point in history, it was their room. No one knows for sure. Getting back to my story, I'll tell you about what I saw one day while waiting outside after school. As I mentioned, I refused to wait inside it until someone else was home. My gut just told me not to risk it. I was walking back and forth, pacing the long dirt driveway, and I felt like something was watching me. My first thought was possibly the trees, maybe a bird. I searched the tree line, then scanned up the trunks to the branches.
There were so many trees that I shrugged it off and continued kicking dirt on the driveway, patiently passing the time. Overwhelmed with another wave of uneasiness, I again looked around me. It felt like whatever it was boring holes in me with its eyes, and I shuddered at the thought. I turned to face the front of the house and combed the windows with my gaze. My eye fell upon my sister's window and the slightly parted blinds. I blinked multiple times and squinted at the window. Was I really seeing this? Did she have something propped against her window that may have laid against the blinds, causing them to part like that? I thought long and hard and shook my head at my own inner question. Her bed was next to the window. There would be nothing but the side of it against that wall. My eyes grew wider as I continued to stare up at the window in shock. I watched on as the blinds slowly retreated and fell back into place. I gulped. Just at that moment, my sister bumped into me. "Last one of the house is a rotten egg," she giggled as she sprinted towards the front door. I was the competitive type, but not that day. That day, I would let her win. I was not going inside that house until my parents got home. However long that took, I would wait. As I have made you aware, this house of haunts has many stories and evil memories. There is one last one I feel like I should share that will help you understand why I say something recited in my sister's room. Sure, the window event was creepy in itself, but this one takes the cake. First of all, there was the feeling. Whenever I went into my sister's room, I was just overwhelmed by a feeling of invading, as if it was silently telling me to get out. I brushed it off, of course, because at that time, we hadn't lived there long, and I just assumed it was the age of the house leaving me unsettled. Then one evening, I was in my sister's room watching television with her while our mom made dinner. As I have explained, her bed is against the wall with the window. Well, her dresser was perched over by her bedroom door near the hallway. We were laughing at a silly kids show. The sun was going down outside, but the room was still quite lit with daylight. Enough so that I was able to get over the creepy feeling I would get being in her room. As a commercial break came on, I got up to go to the bathroom. As I stood, everything on top of her dresser, a hairbrush, a few articles of clothing, and her makeup bag, fell off onto the floor. Unable to take a step forward, I glanced over my shoulder at my sister to see if she had seen that happen as well. The look on her face was priceless. Her mouth was agape in a way I had never seen. Her eyes beamed as wide as they would go, and she was nibbling her bottom lip. She brought her eyes from the dresser and met mine. Yes, indeed, she had seen it too. Now, sometimes in this house, I was scared, and sometimes I liked to tease whatever it was just to see what it would do. So on my way to the bathroom, before I exited her room, I asked it to put everything back the way it was before I came back. My sister rushed to my side, refusing to be alone in the room, and waited outside the bathroom for me to finish. Once we were back in her room, everything that had been brushed off on her floor was back atop her dresser. Now that was some trick. It took my sister nearly a week to agree to sleep in her room again after that one. My room was on the opposite side of the wall to my sister's. I would hear scratching noises in the middle of the night, like there was possibly a rat in the wall. I chalk it up to just that because the house was historically old and, as I mentioned, needing constant repairs. One evening, the scratching was so loud I thought something was going to break through the wall at any moment. I was tossing and turning in bed, even tried a pillow over my head to muffle the noise to no avail. Defeated, I went to her room to investigate the noise. I wondered how she could sleep through it. As I entered her dark room, the noise halted. I held my breath, and the feeling of not being wanted was the heaviest it had ever been. It was as if in my mind's eye, I could see it glaring at me through the darkness of the room, daring me to take one more step forward.
I stood there in a panic. I was not going to walk any further in the room, but I did not feel safe turning my back to the darkness to walk out of there either. With a quivering whisper, I spoke to the darkness. "I'm just going back to bed. I'll leave you alone." As I began to turn around, something quite solid knocked into my legs and took me down. My legs buckled and I landed with a crumpled thud on her floor. My first reaction was to search the darkness for what had knocked me off my feet. I thought ghosts were opaque. How could they hit you with such a solid force? I have never answered that question. But something had, in fact, hit me so hard it took me down. I remained on the floor for a few good minutes, wondering if my sister had woken from the noise. But eventually, her soft snores permeated the blackness, and I knew somehow she slept right through it. After finally gaining my wits, I climbed to my feet ever so slowly. This time I was going to walk backwards towards the hallway until I was fully out of her room, then beeline it for my room. That was the plan anyway, until the scratching noise resumed right next to where I stood. Then all my planning went to the wind, and my feet took flight. I ran so fast out of her room, I almost couldn't stop before I hit the wall. I turned and ran to my room and shut my door and locked it. The scratching noise continued all night, unlike other nights when it would come and go. But I will tell you one thing. I never investigated the sound after that night. I had my mom buy me some earplugs and started using them on a nightly basis. Did I ever see anything in the house? Many times, mostly out of the corner of my eye, but the experiences seemed to be creepier, not knowing exactly what or who was causing it. We lived in that house for 15 years. My sister and I dubbed it the House of Horrors. I'm still not quite sure what was causing the activity, but the house had been built over battlefields. That much I know.
A couple of years ago, some friends and I were going on a rafting trip together. We always try to get together to do something every year since we all graduated from college and moved to different parts of the country. This just happened to be the activity we can all agree on this year. The trip itself was really fun, and it was nice to see all of my old friends, but this isn't a story about outdoor adventures. When we got out to the river, I happened to look down on the ground and saw a glint from something buried in the sand. I reached down, curious about what it could be. I was really surprised to see that a small silver locket came out with a chain attached to it. It was oval in shape, but didn't have any sort of markings on it that made it distinguishable from any other locket of its type. Curious, I opened it to see what could have been inside it, but when I opened it, there wasn't anything on the other side. Just blank spots where pictures could be placed. At this point, my silence had been noticed, and my friend Julie saw what I had in my hand. After finding out that I had just found it in the sand, she seemed to take an interest in it. I gave it to her since I really had no interest in it other than thinking it was cool. After a picnic lunch, we all separated. Everything after this is what Julie told me happened to her after she got home. At first, she told me nothing was out of the ordinary. In fact, she didn't unpack her bag for a couple of days. When she did so, she found the locket inside the pocket of the jeans she had been wearing when we went rafting. At first, she didn't really remember why she had been drawn to it so strongly at the time. After all, it was just a simple oval locket, nothing special. She put it in her jewelry box and put it out of her mind. Julie is typically a night owl, but she told me that for the first few days of her getting back from her trip, that she constantly felt tired. No matter how much sleep she got the night before, it was like she woke up exhausted. She was going to go to the doctor if she continued to feel poorly the next day, just to make sure. On the fourth day back, she woke up like she always did. This time, though, she seemed to feel fully rested. Julie convinced herself almost immediately that she must have caught a minor cold during the time she was away, and it had taken a few days for her to kick it.
She went into the bathroom to brush her teeth when she looked in the mirror and noticed that she was wearing the silver locket. She knew that she hadn't put it on or even taken it out of her jewelry box since the day she had put it there. She told me she was weirded out big time. She had never been known to sleepwalk, but even if she had done that, to have walked over to the box and picked out this one item in a dead sleep didn't seem right or even possible. Without any other real explanation, she just had to accept either she had put it on and forgotten or had somehow been able to put it on herself while she was asleep. She took it off and put it back and finished getting ready for her work. That night when she got home, she was sorting through the mail that she had gotten that day, mostly junk mail, and she happened to look over to the end of the counter. There on the end sat the locket. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. For the first time, she said that she thought someone was in her apartment and had been there since the night before. Julie grabbed a knife from the butcher block and started going from room to room, looking for signs that someone was there. The thing that she said didn't make sense to her, though, is why put the locket out? Why would someone not steal the jewelry, her laptop, the television? Why just put it out on the counter or put it on her while she slept? What kind of weirdo was she dealing with? After a thorough search of the house, she determined that no one else was there. But it was possible they had left while she was at work. She called the 24-hour locksmith and had them come out and rekey the locks to her place just to make sure she felt safe. That night, she went to bed a little nervous. But after a long day at work and the anxiety she felt when she came home, she quickly fell asleep, wrapped in the warmth of her blankets. Sometime in the middle of the night, she woke up feeling cold. The blankets that had been there were no longer on her. When she looked around the bed, she didn't see them anywhere. If she kicked them off, they would have been on the side or the foot of the bed, but the floor was empty. Julie told me she felt like her home, the place where she was supposed to be safe, no longer felt that way. Violated was the word she used. The thing that seemed to scare her the most, though, was that the locket was back around her neck when she woke up. Terrified of what it meant, she ripped it off and threw it across the room. As soon as she did so, an intense feeling of nausea passed over her. She told me she thought she was going to throw up and got up and tried to race to the bathroom. When she was a few feet from the door, though, it slammed shut, and she ran straight into the door. This is where her story gets stranger, though. Julie told me she would have fallen to the ground, but some unseen force seemed to pin her to the wall. She couldn't move, no matter how hard she fought. This seemed to last for about 15 seconds before she slumped to the floor. She said she knew she had to get out of there as quickly as she could. She knew that it wasn't a person doing these things to her, but some sort of ghost. She packed a quick overnight bag and checked into a hotel for the night, just trying to get some distance between her and whoever was back there. The next day, she went back thinking that the daylight would protect her from what was happening there. When she walked in, she noticed that the blankets and sheets that had been on her bed were sitting on one of the chairs in her living room. She hadn't gotten more than 10 steps in when she heard something hit the floor in the kitchen. Walking over, she was sure she knew what it was before she even saw it. There on the tiles was the silver locket. Ever since she had brought it home, there had been problems. Whatever was in her apartment, this thing was attached to this piece of jewelry. She ended up taking the locket to a secondhand store and leaving it in the overnight donation drop area. She hoped that by removing it from her home, that she would also remove the presents that had been there. Nothing happened after she got rid of the locket, but a few months later, she ended up moving out and finding somewhere else to live. I think that she never really felt safe in there after that. I can't say that I blame her. In her position, I would have done the same. When I was younger, My group of friends and I used to go trick-or-treating together every Halloween. We have known each other since before kindergarten, so we have been doing this for quite some time. Our parents had always gone with us until we were 11, when we were finally able to convince them to let us go out by ourselves with the promise that we would only go to the houses in the neighborhood. We readily agreed, just excited to be getting to go out on our own. That year, we were all going as our favorite superheroes. Me, I chose Superman. I was all dressed up, and my friends were there, and we were ready to go out and have fun. My mom gave all of us the stereotypical talk about not talking to strangers, which got a collective eye roll from the entire group. But there wasn't any way she was going to let any of us out of the house without it. Safety speech over, we walked out the door, ready to score a bunch of candy. It had been about an hour, and we weren't ready to call it a night. We still had a lot of houses that we could go to so we could increase our stash. So we walked over to the next block. We had just started walking away from the first house when we all saw a little kid in a ghost outfit. Just a long sheet with some eye holes cut out of it, standing there with a pumpkin bucket at the end of the path. They looked by their size to be about 6 or 7 years old, so definitely too young to be out on their own. But there wasn't anyone around that seemed to be with them. I was a little concerned that they were lost, so I went up to talk to them. "Hey, where are your parents? Are you all alone?"
All I could see was a set of bright blue eyes staring back at me, almost terrified to see me.
I figured that the kid was shy and that he was told not to talk to strangers. I tried to ask for a name and introduce myself and my friends, but all I got was silence. This kid was either terrified of us or completely mute. Being dressed as Superman and all, I wasn't going to just leave the kid there by himself, so I took his hand and tried to lead him with me. When I grabbed the hand through the sheet, it felt really cold, which seemed odd at the time since it was pretty warm for this time of year. We walked down the block. I did everything I could to get the little ghost to talk, but they remained silent. Every time we would go up to the door to a house, the kid would refuse to move an inch down the walkway to get candy. Their bucket didn't have a single piece of candy in it, which seemed sad. I mean, why go trick-or-treating if you weren't going to go get any candy? But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to make sense. These kids were out here all by themselves and wouldn't even talk to another kid, not to mention trying to get them to go up to the door of a complete stranger. As the night was coming to a close, I was unsure what to do about our silent new friends. We hadn't seen anyone out looking for a lost kid, and it wasn't like they didn't stand out, given the low-tech costume they had on. Once we had gone to the last house we planned on hitting, I made a decision. I would take him back to my house and tell my mom what was going on. It wasn't like she could be mad at me, since it wasn't like I was bringing some stray dog home. I mean, this was a lost kid. I had to do it. Not wanting the kid to go home empty-handed, I convinced my friends to each give up some of their candy so the kid could have some treats for later. Not everyone was happy about it since they had done all the work to get the candy, and now they were giving it up. But in the end, they all relented and picked out a number of choice pieces out of their pillowcases. It is a tradition that we leave the kid's house that we start out at until last, thinking that we will be able to split up all of the remaining candy that is left unclaimed at the end of the night. So we walk up to the door of my home, ready to give my mom our best trick or treat that we can. I want the ghost to at least have a chance to go to one house, so I grab the little kid's hand and we walk up the steps to my front door. I ask the ghost if they want to press the doorbell, but all I get is a slight shake of the head telling me no. Not wanting to wait any longer, one of my friends steps up and presses a button. My mom comes to the door with a big bowl of candy, ready to start dishing it out to my friends and me. But then she gets this weird look on her face when she sees me. I don't really know why she's looking at me so weird. "What are you doing, dragging that sheet around with you?" She cocks her head to the side. I didn't know what she was talking about. I mean, it wasn't the greatest costume, but the kid was obviously young. I had some pretty silly costumes growing up myself. I told her we had found these kids standing by themselves on the sidewalk, and we didn't want to leave them there. So you took their ghost costume and ran off with it? Why would you do that? She looked like she was about to get angry. I turned to look at the kid, but all I had in my hand was a sheet. The pumpkin bucket was sitting neatly on the ground like it had been placed there so it wouldn't tip over, and the sheet lay in a pile on the ground with me holding one corner of it. I started to stutter and stammer, not sure what to say. I mean, I had just been holding the kid's hand just a few seconds ago. There was no way they could have gotten away without us noticing. But here I stood with a sheet and a pumpkin bucket. Now, I don't know if for sure if that was a ghost that went trick-or-treating with us. Between the cold hand and the not speaking, I am led to believe that we had experienced an apparition of a kid. I know I was glad my friends had been there to back up my story, even though my mom didn't seem to believe a word of it. That was definitely the craziest Halloween any of us ever had, and one I won't forget. Ever since I have moved into my home, I have been terrorized by something that seems to be getting closer and closer to me. At this point, I don't know what to do because I fear if it goes on any longer, then I might be in real danger. I guess I'll start at the beginning, and hopefully someone can give me some sort of insight into what I can do. The company I have worked at for the past 10 years needed to transfer me to a city in Nebraska to help set up a new satellite office that we were opening in the Midwest. Because this was going to be a long-term assignment, the company offered to pay for my moving expenses. Really, what I was being told was that I would either be moving or they would find someone who would. So I went online and found a home in the area that I would be working in that I could get a long-term lease. It took me a few weeks, but I found a nice 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home less than a mile from my office. A few weeks later, I was moving in and ready to start my new adventure. The first day, basically, all I got accomplished was getting boxes into the basic rooms that they were going into. My mattress was placed on the floor since I didn't have the energy left to put it together, and by this time, I was ready to go to sleep. I laid a couple of sheets down and grabbed a blanket from one of the boxes, and when I laid down, I was asleep almost immediately. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I'm usually a pretty deep sleeper, so this was an unusual thing for me. I looked around at first, unsure of where I was from the strange shadowed shapes around me. Quickly, though, I came to my senses and remembered that I was in my new place and that the weird shapes were just the unpacked boxes around me. I rolled back over, intending to go back to sleep, when I heard a strange rapping coming from somewhere in the front of the house. At first, I chalked it up to being unfamiliar noises from a strange new house and tried to ignore it. The longer it went on, though, I knew I wouldn't get back to sleep until I found out what was making the noise so I can quiet it, or, if anything, quiet my imagination. I got up and wrapped my robe around me and walked out of my room. In my head, I just knew that as soon as I got to the living room, where the noise seemed to be originating from, that it would cease. However, as soon as I breached the threshold, the knocking didn't stop. It continued on and on. It seemed to be coming from the window next to the door. This particular window was frosted, so I couldn't see out of it, but it appeared like there was some sort of figure standing out there. The door had a peephole, which I went up to and looked out of, but the step was surprisingly empty. "Hello? Is someone there?" I asked out the door. But the only response that I got was the continued knocking sound. At this point, I was fed up with the noise and decided to be brave and open the door. I tried to unlatch the deadbolt as quietly as I could, but when it disengaged, it made a hollow thunk that was probably quieter than I heard. I grabbed the handle with a shaking hand and took a deep breath, not sure of what I would confront on the other side. I twisted the handle and swung the door open as fast as I could. I could feel my pulse beating through my entire body, ready to run at a moment's notice. But when I looked out, there wasn't anyone there. The stoop was empty, and the knocking stopped. I stepped back to look through the window again, and where the figure had been just seconds before seemed clear. I didn't understand how someone could have moved that fast. Maybe when they heard me undo the lock, they simply bolted. But the knocking continued until I opened the door. There was no screen door, so it couldn't have been a breeze causing the noise, and there wasn't any sort of decorations on the door that could have made the noise. All I could do was shake my head and close the door, thinking that maybe it had been some sort of bird or another nocturnal animal being mischievous. I closed the door and relocked it, half expecting that the noise would start as soon as the bolt slid home. But no knocking came from the doorway. I walked back toward my room and stopped to take another look back at the door, almost daring the knocking to start again. But after it remained quiet for a few seconds, I walked back the rest of the way to my room, and after tossing and turning for a few minutes trying to silence my mind, I fell back asleep. Nothing happened for a few days after that. I expected to hear the noise every night, but 4 nights passed before it seemed to return again. This time, though, the noise sounded different than it had the first time. It seemed to echo throughout the house instead of just being centered at one point. As I got up to try and find the source, something about my home seemed to feel off, almost unwelcoming. I knew that the noise had unnerved me the first night, putting me on edge, but after a few nights of silence, I thought that things were going to be okay. That feeling of security seemed to fall away as if it had never been there as I walked towards the living room. When I entered the living room, I hugged my robe a little closer to me. The room felt colder than the rest of the house, and the unwelcome feeling seemed to ratchet up to another level. Every part of me told me to get out of there, to leave and go back to my room and get into bed. But I was a grown woman. I wasn't going to let a childish fear get the better of me. The knocking noise was louder tonight than it had been the other day. It only took a second to realize, though, why it was different. The noise wasn't coming from outside the door, but inside of my house, in the coat closet, a few feet inside the door. A cold chill ran down my spine, and goosebumps sprang up on my arms. Someone or something was inside my house. The knocking had definitely put me on edge, and my mind ran to worst-case scenarios as I imagined someone had gotten in, and now they were trying to torment me by messing with my mind. As scared as I was, there was no way someone was going to come into the place I lived in to do this kind of thing to me. In an act of stupidity, I walked over to the closet door and opened it up, ready for some knife-wielding psychopath to be there waiting for me. Just like the first time, though, as soon as I opened the door, the noise stopped, and I was left there staring into an empty closet. Finding no one there had 2 effects. One, a wave of relief washed over me, knowing that someone wasn't waiting in my home trying to scare me. But mostly it pissed me off. I knew I hadn't imagined the entire thing, at least I didn't think so. I had the place inspected before I moved in, and there hadn't been any sign of rodents of any kind in the walls. But who had heard of mice or rats making knocking noises? I know I hadn't. What else could it be, though? I decided I would call someone else to come and check the next day since, obviously, the last guy didn't know what he was doing if he missed something so obvious. Feeling better about figuring out what was going on in my house, I walked back to my room. I had just gotten settled in bed when the knocking noise started again. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't tune it out no matter what I did. That exterminator couldn't be here fast enough. The next morning I had looked online for a company that had good reviews and would be willing to come out that day to check out my problem. I knew that same-day service was likely to cost me more money, but I wasn't going to go another night without sleep. It took me a couple of tries, but I finally got someone to agree to come and check out the house later that afternoon. When the guy arrived, I told him what had been going on, and he went to work looking for any sign of rats, mice, or some other vermin that were living in the walls. The idea that some dirty creature was inside my home made my skin crawl, and I was anxious to get rid of them. 3 hours later, he come to the front door with a frown on his face. He told me there wasn't any sign of any animals living inside my house. I told him that couldn't be true, but he insisted that it was and handed me my invoice before walking back to his truck. Now that I had two people telling me that there weren't mice in my walls, and I hadn't found anything the 2 times that I had tried to confront whatever it was that was knocking in my home, I figured I should look online to see what else could be causing the knocking noises. I fired up the internet browser on my computer and went to a search engine and typed in the words, "strange knocking noises inside my home." I noticed there were thousands of hits for the search. I didn't figure it would be such a popular subject, but that meant I was bound to find something that could help me. The first thing on the list was a site dedicated to talking about haunted houses. I quickly passed by that because I didn't believe in ghosts, so I didn't take that option seriously. But the more I kept scrolling down, it seemed like nearly every page kept talking about ghosts, spirits, or demons of some kind. There were a lot of people with overactive imaginations, I guess. After a few pages of the same stuff, I shut down the internet. That's the problem with the internet these days. Anyone can post anything, even if it is totally fake. I just hoped that I was done hearing noises. It could just be the house settling. That kind of made sense, but I really didn't believe that. I didn't get any days off from the nighttime disturbance this time. It came back that night louder than ever. It sounded like someone was taking a hammer to the wall of my house. I got up to put an end to this once and for all. This couldn't go on indefinitely. I couldn't go on without getting any sleep. I walked down the hall, and I noticed why it seemed like it was so loud. The knocking noise had moved from the closet and now was going on inside the wall at the end of the hall where my bedroom was. In just 4 days, it had moved nearly half the distance from the front door to my bedroom. I took a few steps backward, trying to put distance between myself and this noise. Deep inside of me, a voice told me I was in danger and I had to get out of there, but I stood there frozen. Unable to come to grips with what was happening, I could see my breath, and I felt the cold air prickle my nose. "What is happening in this house?" I asked to no one in particular. I ran back to my room and shut the door, hoping that the barrier would give me some sense of safety, but all it did was make me feel trapped inside my own house. I pulled out my phone, and as much as I didn't want to consider the possibility that whatever was going on could be a ghost, I went to the internet and started to look over some of the pages talking about how you could tell if your house was haunted. At first, I felt stupid for even looking at these pages, but with every one, it seemed like the things that were happening pointed to this possibility. The sites talked about knocking noises, feelings of dread, cold temperatures, and a variety of other things. What they didn't agree on was what to do to get rid of them. There were a few common things, though, which talked about burning jasmine to clean the home, crystals, or bringing a medium to communicate with the deceased. There was only so much I was willing to try, but burning jasmine and maybe a crystal wasn't something I was opposed to trying. At least now I had a plan. As absurd as I thought it was a plan. Since I knew I was unlikely to be able to go to sleep, I looked up places where I could find crystals and jasmine. There were a few places, but none that were really close by, the nearest being about 50 miles away. I didn't really think that I had much choice though, and just accepted the fact that I would make the drive. The rest of the night, the sound would start and stop at various times and would last for 2 to 10 minutes at a time. I tried to keep my mind occupied by reading, listening to music, or watching television. But my thoughts kept drifting to thoughts of ghosts and all the horror films I had watched about people being tormented by spirits. I had always just brushed this off as fantasy, but confronting it now, they took on a whole new meaning. I almost turned around a half dozen times the entire drive there as my logical mind grappled with what I thought was going on. You don't go over 40 years of believing one thing and just overnight give it up without a fight. The only thing that kept me from doing so was not wanting to spend another sleepless night in that house. Finally, I pulled up in front of a small shop located in the corner of a strip mall. Walking in, I could smell incense in the air, and I saw an older woman that had wavy brown hair with streaks of gray going through it behind a counter. I had gotten there only about 10 minutes after they had opened, so I was the only other person in the shop. I walked up to her, and she asked me if she could help me find anything. I must have looked a little skeptical because she seemed to sense my hesitation in telling her. "Ah, I see I have a skeptic in my shop, huh?" Her smile and willingness to talk about exactly what I was thinking put me instantly at ease. "Well, how about this? Why don't you tell me why you're here?" I proceeded to tell her everything that had happened since I had moved into the house. She sat there with the same kind smile the entire time as I told my story, never interrupting me once or making a face like she didn't believe a word I had said. If someone had come to me with this type of story, I would have called them crazy. When I was done, she nodded to me and led me over to a section of shelves that held some dried bundles of plants. She took a small bundle and handed it to me. "This is jasmine. You will want to burn it and make sure the smoke gets into every corner of all the rooms in your house." Then we walked over to another set of shelves, and she told me that these crystals were quartz. They were all clear and came in various sizes and shapes. I waited for her to pick one out and hand it to me, but she just sat there and waited expectantly. When I didn't make a move to take one, she went on further. "You have to be the one to pick the crystal. What one speaks to me may not speak to you." I didn't know what she meant by the crystal had to speak to me, but I picked up a medium-sized one, and we walked over to the register where I paid for my do-it-yourself Ghostbuster kit and left. All things considered, this was a much better experience than I expected it to be. I don't know what I expected, but a kindly woman just looking to help wasn't it. As soon as I got home, I took out my crystal and put it next to my bed. If this thing were going to protect me, I wanted it as close to me as possible when I was sleeping. I also took the jasmine, and after lighting, I went around to every room in my home and let the smoke fill the area for a few seconds before moving on to the next space. After I was done, the house didn't feel any different, but only time would tell if the cleansing had worked. The next few days were quiet. I was convinced that the purification had worked, or most likely that the noises had some sort of rational explanation, and that whatever was causing them had worked itself out. Work was stressful, but after being able to sleep for the first time in a few days, I was able to actually get something accomplished. Then tonight came, and I am at a loss for what to do. I went to bed at my regular time. With work so crazy the last few days, I didn't have the energy to stay up late even with the day off tomorrow. I quickly fell asleep after reading only a few pages of my latest novel. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a pounding noise on my bedroom door. I bolted upright in bed and just sat there, unsure of what or who could be on the other side. I didn't dare open the door. Obviously, if someone was there, they didn't need my help getting in. And if it was a ghost, the cleansing had obviously failed to get rid of it. With the force of the pounding on the door, whatever it was, it seemed angry. So I sat there, unsure of what to do. Am I being stalked by something evil? Does it just want to say hello and let me know that it is present? Does it think that I am intruding on its home? Or does it have some other nefarious intentions towards me? I know something had to change though. because it is obviously coming and it is getting closer. I'm not sure how long I have, but I fear that before too long, it may not matter what precautions I take, it will get in. I had just moved out of my childhood home and into my very first rental house. The excitement I felt to begin this new chapter in my life had no words. As a child, you daydream what life will be like when you get to begin your own. I dreamt of white picket fences, a cute little puppy, or falling in love and starting a family. The possibilities were endless. Obviously, as an adult, you realize life is much different from your daydreams and you have to save longer for the white picket fence. But I found myself a true gem. It was tucked into an older cul-de-sac in an area of a town where I could walk to mostly anything, including school. It was perfect. It even had a second bedroom, although small, for an office or craft room. During the first week of unpacking and arranging the house, one of my best friends, Mandy, came over to see the new place. I had not really had time to splurge on a nice dining table yet, so we sat on the sofa and ordered in some Chinese. A while after eating and giggling about college life, Mandy went into my master bedroom to check out the layout. I noticed right away the door to the master bath was shut. This was odd since I was the only one that lived there and I never shut it. When I attempted to open the bathroom door to show her inside, it was locked. Again, really peculiar. I looked at Mandy. I was obviously confused, but Mandy merely shrugged her shoulders. "It's okay, show me later when you find a key," she said. I shook my head in disbelief and we started to trot out the room. Then a noise stopped us just under the doorframe. It was the sound of the shower curtain opening. Mandy turned to me and whispered, "No one else is here, right?" But of course she already knew I was the only one who lived there. I slowly shook my head, shivering and trying not to be terrified. We glanced over our shoulders at the still closed door and went back into the living room and called the police. Mandy and I waited outside for the police to arrive. I was extremely stressed, nipping at my nails and pacing. Could there be someone in my bathroom? We had been eating and talking for nearly 2 hours before going into my bedroom. Could a person hide that long? And what did they want? The police arrived and we followed. Pointing the way to the bathroom, a policewoman who was tall and slender with "Take Charge" written all over her face grabbed the door handle to the bathroom and it opened right away. Mandy gasped. I stood there eternally perplexed. Were we going crazy? We watched as their flashlights encircled the entirety of the bathroom. There was nothing in there. The policewoman put her flashlight down by her side, noting no visible threat. "Is this a joke?" We both vigorously shook our heads. "No, ma'am. Something was in there." She scoffed and walked with her partner outside. Obviously, she didn't believe us at all. After an outside perimeter check revealed no obvious signs of an attempted break-in, they were gone, and we were left shrouded in our own disbelief. Mandy offered me to stay at her house for the night just so I can get the incident off my mind and start fresh tomorrow. It was not hard for me to agree to that. After one last sweep of my house, I grabbed what I needed for class, turned off all the lights, and locked up. The next morning, I had gone straight to class before going home. Finally, around lunchtime, I had enough time to run home, drop off some textbooks, and grab a couple of other books before my next class. I hung my keys by the front door and made my way to my bedroom. I sat my textbooks from my earlier classes on my dresser and grabbed the ones I needed for my afternoon classes. I suddenly felt a chill. I shivered. Then I felt like I was being watched. I tried to shrug it off as anxiety from what had happened from the night before, but until my gaze fell on my bed was made as I had left it, only there was an imprint on it of an entire person. It was as if someone had laid on it and taken a nap. That had definitely not been me. I grabbed my books and ran out of there as fast as I could. almost forgetting to grab my keys off the hook by the front door. I called Mandy and told her all about it. I was seriously freaked out. Mandy suggested she stay the night with me so I didn't have to be alone, and maybe it would help me adjust to my new place better. Mandy came over that evening after school. She brought popcorn and a couple of movies and a bottle of wine. Finally, after 2 movies, we were both getting exhausted. I turned off the TV and the lights, and we went to bed. Mandy was sleeping in my bed with me because I had a queen. We lay down and we were talking a little bit about school and guys. Most of the events that had happened in the house were far from my mind by now. I was completely exhausted but at ease. We both drifted off to sleep. Suddenly, I was awakened in the middle of the night and gazed at my bedside clock. 2:13 a.m. I could not figure out why I woke up, so I searched the darkness for answers. Seeing and hearing nothing, I rolled over on my side to face Mandy. Even though the room was dark, I could see it. Somehow, its form was darker than the room. It was the shape of a person but with no legs, and it hovered almost all the way to the height of the ceiling. I blinked my eyes to focus better. Still there, it sounded like it was hissing or growling. I couldn't discern which. Too scared to call out for her, I tried to nudge Mandy awake with my foot under the covers. Nothing. She slept on. My heart was pounding. I was terrified that the thing was going to attack her, so I nudged her again harder while keeping my eyes on the thing. Finally, she stirred and blinked her eyes at me. She started to sit up. "Why did you kick me?" My eyes must have been about ready to pop out of my head in terror. I was trying my best to tell her with my eyes, while in pitch black room, to shut up and run, but she just kept looking at me for answers. I looked over again at the darkness that was still hovering right next to her. Without a second to answer, I just yelled, "Run!" The covers were tossed aside and we were both pounding footfalls out of my bedroom and into my living room. Breathless, she asked me, "What are we running from?" I was flipping on every light in the house at this point while she was trailing behind me. "The thing by my bed, it was right next to you." Her eyes grew in horror. What thing?" "It was as tall as the ceiling." Whatever it was did not follow us into the living room. We stayed there for the remainder of the night with every light in the house on. The next morning, I moved in back with my parents and broke my lease. I could not handle another night in that house.